The coffee hit the floor before the scream did. Not spilled. Thrown. A full cup of it. Sent sideways off a wheelchair tray by a hand that didn't even look back to see what it had done. The mug shattered against the tile of Rosie's diner, and for one long second, every fork in that restaurant stopped moving. A woman in a gray cardigan sat frozen in her wheelchair, coffee soaking to the lap blanket she kept folded over her knees. She didn't cry out. She didn't move. She just stared at the dark stain spreading across the fabric like she'd trained herself a long time ago not to react to things that other people did to her body without asking. 3 young men stood over her table laughing. Not with her. At her. One of them, tall, blonde, wearing a jacket that cost more than the diner's weekly gas bill, was already turning back to his friends like the moment was already over. Like she was already forgotten. Behind the counter, a black man in a stained apron set down the plate he was holding. Slowly, deliberately, the way a man sets something down when he already knows what he's about to do is going to cost him something. His name was Elijah Turner. He had a 7-year-old daughter doing homework in the back booth. He had $11 in his checking account and a manager who had told him twice this month that his job depended on keeping wealthy customers happy no matter what they did. He walked out from behind that counter anyway. Nobody in that diner knew the woman in the wheelchair owned a company worth more money than the entire town of Millbrook had seen in its 140-year history. Nobody knew that within 3 weeks, one of those laughing young men would be escorted out of a courthouse by his own father's lawyers. Nobody knew that the manager standing by the register, already reaching for his phone to fire somebody, was about to lose far more than an employee. All anybody in that diner knew, in that one frozen second, was that a stranger had just been humiliated in public, and a tired man in an apron had decided that wasn't going to stand. This is that story. If stories like this one matter to you, stories about ordinary people who choose to do the right thing even when it costs them everything, stay with us until the end. This channel exists because of viewers like you. A like, a comment, a subscribe. It tells us to keep telling these stories. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened in Rosie's diner that Thursday afternoon, you have to understand who Elijah Turner was before anyone ever knew his name. Millbrook, Georgia was not a place people found on purpose. It was a place people passed through on the way to somewhere else, or a place people had simply never left. Population just under 6,000. One stoplight that actually mattered, a Baptist church on every third corner, and a courthouse square that still had a Confederate-era water pump nobody had gotten around to removing, mostly because nobody had gotten around to noticing it in about 40 years. Rosie's Diner sat at the corner of 5th and Magnolia, in a squat brick building that had been a hardware store before it was a diner, and a feed store before that. The awning out front said Rosie's in red script that had faded to a color closer to rust. Inside, the booths were cracked red vinyl, patched in places with silver duct tape that had gone gray with age. The coffee was strong. The pie was better. And if you sat in the same booth long enough on a Tuesday morning, you'd see the same 6 regulars, the same shuffle of small talk, the same rhythm that held that town together longer than most of its residents had been alive. Elijah Turner had worked there for 2 years, ever since his life folded in on itself the way lives sometimes do, quietly, without warning, over the course of about 4 terrible months. He was 34 years old, tall, broad to the shoulders in the way of a man who used to play football and never entirely lost a frame, though the years since had worn something into his face that hadn't been there in his 20s. He kept his hair cut close. He kept his voice low. He said yes, ma'am, and no, sir, to customers twice his age and meant it every time, not because he'd been raised to perform politeness, but because his mother had raised him to believe that dignity was something you gave other people first and let them decide what to do with it. Before Rosie's, Elijah had been 3 semesters from a civil engineering degree at Georgia Southern. He'd been good at it, not just passing good. The kind of good where professors pulled him aside after class to ask if he considered a graduate program. The kind of good where he designed a stormwater drainage retrofit for a rural county as a junior year project that the county actually ended up building 2 years later, uncredited, because nobody thought to ask a 20-year-old student for permission. He didn't talk about that much anymore. It felt like a photograph of somebody else's life. His wife, Renata, had died when their daughter Maya was 2 years old. An aneurysm, sudden, unrelated to anything anyone could have caught or prevented. The kind of death that doctors describe using the word, nothing could have been done, because that phrase is somehow supposed to make it easier to carry, and it never is. Elijah had been in his second semester of senior year. He withdrew within a week. He told himself he'd go back once things settled. Things never settled. They just became a new kind of unsettled that he learned to live inside. Now his morning started at 5:30. He made oatmeal because it was cheap, and Maya liked cinnamon in it. He braided her hair while she ate, not because he was especially skilled at it, but because he'd watched enough videos on his cracked phone screen at 1 in the morning to get functional, if not elegant. He walked the 4 blocks to Milbert Elementary before opening shift at Rosie's, and some mornings, if he had 8 extra minutes, they'd stop at the crumbling brick wall by the old mill and count how many birds they could spot before the bell rang. Maya was 7. She had her mother's eyes, the same particular shade of amber brown that used to make strangers stop and comment, and she had inherited exactly none of her father's caution. She asked questions the way other kids breathe, constantly, without apology, and Elijah had made peace with the fact that most days he had no good answer for at least half of them. Daddy, why do some people get to be rich and some people don't? He'd been drying dishes when she asked that one, maybe 2 months before everything changed. He'd thought about it for a long moment. Sometimes it's luck, he said. Sometimes it's who your family already was. Sometimes people work hard for it. But baby, being rich and being good aren't the same thing. Don't ever mix those up. Maya had considered this with the seriousness only a 7-year-old can bring to a kitchen sink philosophy lesson, then nodded once, like she was filing away for later use. She did that a lot. Filed things away. Elijah sometimes wondered what she was building in there, behind those amber eyes, with all the things she collected. He worked the counter and the grill at Rosie's 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when the manager needed him. The pay wasn't good. It was never going to be good, but it covered rent on the 2-bedroom apartment over the laundromat on Willow Street, and it covered Maya's school supplies, and most months, if he was careful, it covered a little more than survival. What nobody at Rosie's Diner knew about Elijah Turner, because he never told them, because there was no version of that conversation that didn't sound like either bragging or begging, was that he still did math in his head sometimes, late at night, working out load calculations and drainage gradients on old projects just to keep the part of his brain that used to love it from going completely dark. He kept his engineering textbooks in a box under his bed. He told himself it was sentimental. He knew, somewhere underneath that, it was something closer to hope, kept alive on a very low simmer, because a man raising a daughter alone doesn't have room for the kind of hope that burns hot enough to hurt. The diner's manager was a man named Carl Hutchins, mid-50s, thinning gray hair combed sideways in a way that fooled nobody, and a permanent expression of man calculating exactly how much trouble something was worth. Carl wasn't cruel, exactly. He was something more common, and in some ways more dangerous. He was afraid. Afraid of losing the lease. Afraid of losing customers. Afraid, most specifically, of one family in particular, the Ashfords, because Whitfield Ashford, patriarch of the family and the richest man in 3 counties, owned the building Rosie's Diner sat inside of, along with roughly a third of downtown Millbrook. And Whitfield Ashford's youngest son, Grant, came into Rosie's Diner most Thursday afternoons with 2 of his college friends, and Carl Hutchins had made it very clear, on more than one occasion, exactly how far his staff was expected to bend to keep that boy happy. They're the reason this place doesn't get sold out from under us, Carl had told Elijah once, not quite meeting his eyes. You understand what I'm saying. Elijah understood exactly what he was saying. He'd understood it for 2 years, watching Grant Ashford and his friends leave 15% tips on $100 tabs while treating the waitstaff like furniture that occasionally spoke. He'd swallowed a lot in that time. He had a daughter, to feed. Swallowing things was, in some ugly practical sense, part of the job description nobody had written down, but everybody knew. He didn't know. On a particular Thursday, the story turns on that the woman rolling to the front door of Rosie's Diner at 2:15 in the afternoon was about to make swallowing impossible. She came in alone. That was the first thing Elijah noticed. The way he noticed most things about the diner, without really trying to. Old habit, old instinct. The leftover vigilance of a man who'd learned to read a room before the room had a chance to surprise him. A woman, mid-40s maybe, in a plain gray cardigan and dark jeans, rolling her own wheelchair through the door with the kind of practice efficiency that told him this wasn't new to her. This wasn't some recent tragedy she was still learning to carry. She had short, dark hair going silver at the temples, sharp eyes, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent years being looked at and had built an entire posture around not reacting to it. She picked a booth near the window, the one with the most clearance, and ordered black coffee and the meatloaf special without opening the menu, like she'd memorized it from the sign outside before she ever walked in. Elijah didn't recognize her. Why would he? Vivian Cross did not do local news. She did not do social media. Not really. Not beyond sanitized corporate counts her communications team ran on her behalf. The face of Cross Dynamics, the $22 billion logistics and infrastructure firm she'd built from a single warehouse contract in Charlotte over the course of 19 years, was not a face that showed up on the cover of magazines at the Piggly Wiggly checkout line. She had made sure of that, deliberately, the way she made sure of most things that mattered to her. What Elijah saw was a woman eating lunch alone on a Thursday afternoon in a small Georgia town, 400 miles from anywhere anyone would expect a woman like her to be. Wayne knows why. 6 weeks earlier, Vivian Cross had been sitting in a boardroom in Atlanta being told by 11 members of her own board of directors that her decision-making had become, in the language of the memo somebody had clearly workshopped for maximum plausible deniability, inconsistent with the company's growth trajectory. What that meant, stripped of the corporate padding, was this. 2 years after a highway accident had taken the use of her legs, half the people who had built their careers on her name had started quietly deciding she was a liability. She had not fought in the room. She had learned a long time ago that fighting inside a room designed to make you lose was rarely the smartest use of energy. She had taken the mandated leave of absence they offered her, packed one suitcase, and driven herself. She still drove. Thank you very much. Her hand controls had been installed the month she got out of rehab, as far from Atlanta as she could get before the exhaustion in her chest outweighed the exhaustion in her arms. She'd stopped in Millbrook because her GPS told her the next gas station was 40 miles up the interstate, and she needed coffee that didn't come from a machine. She'd stayed because nobody in this town knew who she was, and for the first time in longer than she could comfortably admit, that felt less like invisibility and more like air. She had come back to Rosie's Diner 4 times now over 3 weeks. Nobody bothered her. Nobody stared. Not more than the ordinary stare a stranger in a wheelchair draws in a small town where everyone already knows everyone. It was, against every odds she could have named, the most peaceful place she'd been in 2 years. That peace lasted until 2:22 that Thursday, when the front door swung open and Grant Ashford walked in with Wyatt Doyle and Preston Cole trailing behind him, already loud, already laughing about something that happened at the lake house that weekend. The particular volume of young men who have never once in their lives had to consider whether a room had room for them. Elijah felt his stomach tighten the second the bell over the door rang. Not because Grant Ashford had ever done anything violent. He hadn't. It was smaller than that, and somehow worse for being smaller. The way Grant snapped his fingers instead of saying please, the way he called every waitress sweetheart, regardless of her name, the way he'd once sent back a burger 3 times, not because anything was actually wrong with it, but because, as he'd told his friends loud enough for the whole county here, I like watching them scramble. Grant Ashford was 23 years old, home from a business degree at a university his father had bought a library wing for, and he had the specific, dangerous confidence of a young man who had never once been told no by anyone whose opinion he was required to respect. The three of them scanned the diner the way they always did, looking for their usual booth. The corner one, biggest table, best view of the square. It was occupied by Vivian Cross. "That's our spot," Grant said, not to Elijah, not to Carl, just out loud to the room, the way a man announces weather. He walked over and stood at the edge of Vivian's table. "We need this booth," he said. Vivian looked up from her coffee. She'd been in enough rooms with enough men like this one to recognize the shape of the conversation before it started. "I'm sorry," she said evenly. "I need the open side for my chair. There's room at the counter, or—" "The counter doesn't work for us," Grant said, cutting her off, smiling particular smile of a man who has already decided the outcome and is only performing the negotiation for his own entertainment. "We sit here every Thursday. You could move to literally any other table in this place. Most of the other tables don't have clearance of the chair," Vivian said. Still calm, still level. Elijah, from behind the counter, could see exactly what she was doing, explaining a fact of her body to a stranger who had no interest in facts, only in getting what he wanted, and doing it with a patience that told him this wasn't the first time she'd had to have this exact conversation with this exact kind of man. "Not really my problem," Grant said. Wyatt Doyle laughed. Preston Cole didn't laugh. But he didn't say anything either, which in its own way was its own kind of laughing. Elijah set down the towel in his hand. Carl Hutchins, at the register, had gone very still. The way a man goes still when he's hoping a problem will resolve itself before he has to decide which side of it he's standing on. "Sir," Elijah said, walking out from behind the counter, keeping his voice level, keeping it calm, the tone he used with Maya when she was overtired and about to have a meltdown in a grocery store, the tone that said, "I am not the threat here. I am trying to lower the temperature. We got the corner booth by the register opening up in about 5 minutes. I can get you set up there. No problem." "We don't want that booth," Grant said, not even looking at Elijah, still looking down at Vivian. "We want this one." And then, with the same casual cruelty of a man flicking a fly off his sleeve, Grant Ashford reached out and shoved the back corner of Vivian's wheelchair. It wasn't a hard shove. That was almost the worst part of it. How small the gesture was, how little effort it cost him, how completely unbothered he looked doing it. The chair jerked sideways 2 inches. Vivian's coffee slid off the edge of the tray attached to the chair's arm and hit the floor, and the mug shattered. And the coffee splashed dark across the gray cardigan she was wearing and the blanket folded over her knees. The whole diner went quiet. Vivian didn't scream. She didn't cry out. She sat very still, looking down at the stain spreading warm and wet across her lap, her jaw tight, her hands flat on the arms of her chair, doing the thing Elijah recognized instantly because he'd watched his own mother do it 100 times growing up in a town not so different from this one. The specific, practiced stillness of a person absorbing humiliation in public and calculating, in real time, exactly how much of a reaction they can afford to have without making things worse. Grant Ashford looked down at what he'd done and laughed. "Whoops," he said, already turning back to his friends. "Guess she needed the extra napkins anyway." That was the moment Elijah Turner stopped calculating. He crossed the diner floor in 6 steps. He didn't shout. He didn't grab anyone. He stopped directly between Grant Ashford and Vivian Cross's chair, close enough that Grant had to actually look at him instead of pass him. And he said, in a voice that was quiet and completely without doubt, "Apologize to her." The room, which had already gone quiet, went quieter. Carl Hutchins had come around the counter now, hovering, his mouth already half open with whatever placating sentence he was preparing to say to Grant Ashford. Grant looked at Elijah like he was seeing furniture that had just spoken. "Excuse me?" "You put your hands on her chair and knocked her coffee into her lap," Elijah said. "You're going to apologize to her, and then you're going to sit at the table I offered you, or you're going to leave." For 1 second, something flickered across Grant Ashford's face that might have been, in a different man, the beginning of shame. In Grant, it curdled almost immediately into something else. Something closer to disbelief that a black man in a diner apron thought He is standing to speak to him this way in front of his friends. "You know whose family owns this building?" Grant said, low, almost amused. "I know," Elijah said. "Doesn't change what you did." Carl Hutchins had reached him now, his voice pitched high and fast with panic. "Elijah, let's just—" "I'll calm their table. Let's not, Carl," Elijah said, without looking away from Grant. "She's bleeding coffee into her lap," and he laughed about it. "I laugh because it's funny watching everyone panic over spilled drink," Grant said, and there was an edge in his voice now, the first real edge, the sound of a man who was not used to being contradicted and did not like the feeling of it. "You want to keep your job. You'll back off." Elijah felt that sentence land exactly where Grant meant it to land. He thought about Maya in the back booth, headphones on, coloring in a workbook, 7 years old and completely unaware that the next 30 seconds were about to change the shape of both of their lives. He thought about the $11 in his checking account. He thought about 3 semesters of an engineering degree sitting unfinished in a folder he hadn't opened in 6 years, and the box of textbooks on his bed, and every single thing he had swallowed in this diner over 2 years, because swallowing things was cheaper than losing the ability to feed his daughter. He thought about all of that, and he looked at the woman in the wheelchair with coffee soaking through her lap, sitting perfectly still, absorbing one more thing in a lifetime that had apparently required her to absorb quite a lot of things, and he made the decision anyway. "I'm not backing off," Elijah said. Carl Hutchins made a small strangled sound. "Elijah, you're fired," Carl said. It came out of him fast, almost reflexive, the words of a man who had already decided, weeks or months ago, exactly which side of this equation he was going to protect when the moment finally came. "You're done. Get your things." The diner was completely silent now. Somewhere near the counter, someone's fork clinked against a plate, and the sound felt enormous in the quiet. Maya, in the back booth, had pulled off her headphones and was watching, her small face already tightening with the particular fear children develop early when they learn to read the emotional weather of a room. Elijah did not look away from Grant Ashford. His voice, when he spoke again, did not shake. "That's fine," he said. "I'd rather lose this job than keep it by letting you spill coffee on a woman and laugh about it." Vivian Cross, still sitting very still, still absorbing, looked up at him for the first time. Really looked. Something in her face shifted. Not gratitude exactly. Not yet. Something more like recognition, like she was cataloging the kind of person she had almost forgotten still existed. Grant Ashford's jaw worked for a second. Then, because there is a particular kind of coward hiding inside every bully who has never had to face real consequences, he laughed again, shorter this time, more brittle, and said, "Whatever, not worth it," and steered his friends toward the door instead of the corner booth, because the audience he wanted his cruelty performed for had stopped finding it entertaining and started finding it something closer to unforgivable. The bell over the door rang as they left. Nobody in the diner said anything for a long moment. Then Elijah crouched down beside the wheelchair, grabbed a stack of napkins off the nearest table, and held them out to Vivian without a word, the way he might have handed them to any customer having any ordinary bad afternoon, no performance in it at all. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "That shouldn't have happened to you." Vivian took the napkins. Her hands, he noticed, were steady, though something in her eyes was not. "Thank you," she said, and then, glancing toward Carl, who was still standing frozen by the register with his phone half raised like he'd forgot what he'd picked it up to do, "You just lost your job for me." "I lost my job for doing the right thing," Elijah said. "That happens to have been about you. Doesn't change the math." She looked at him for a long moment. Behind him, he could hear Maya's small footsteps crossing the diner floor, the particular quick shuffle of a 7-year-old trying not to look scared and failing at it. "Daddy," Maya said, tugging his sleeve. "Are we in trouble?" Elijah turned and crouched down to her level, the way he always did when the world got too big and loud for her to process, standing up. "No, baby, we're okay. Mr. Carl said you're fired." "I know." Maya's forehead creased with the serious concentration of a child working through a math problem that didn't add up. Is it because you told that man to say sorry? Yeah, Elijah said. It is. Maya considered this for a second, glanced at the woman in the wheelchair, glanced back at her father. That was the right thing to do, though, she said, with the flat, unshakable certainty only children have, before the world teaches them that right things and safe things aren't always the same thing. You always say we should say sorry when we hurt somebody. That's right, Elijah said. So you did the right thing even though you got in trouble. Sometimes that's how it works, baby. Maya nodded once, filing away, the way she filed everything away, and Vivian Cross, watching that exchange from her wheelchair with coffee still cooling in her lap, felt something crack open in her chest that she had not expected and did not entirely know what to do with. She had spent 19 years building a company on the theory that competence mattered more than comfort, that the right decision and the easy decision were rarely the same decision, and that most people, when the moment actually arrived, chose easy. She had built an entire boardroom of people around that theory. And 6 weeks ago, that boardroom had proven her right in the ugliest possible way, choosing comfort over her, quietly, efficiently, without a single raised voice. And here was a man who had just lost his only source of income in front of his own daughter, over a stranger he had never met, because doing anything less would have meant becoming something he apparently could not stand to become. "What's your name?" she asked him. "Elijah Turner." "I'm Vivian." She did not say her last name. "Not yet. Let me buy you both lunch. It's the least I can do." Elijah shook his head, already reaching for Maya's backpack, already recalculating the math of the next several weeks in the back of his mind. Rent, groceries, the electric bill due on the 9th. "You don't owe me anything. You didn't ask for what happened to you." "Neither did you," Vivian said. "And you're the one walking out of here without a job." He didn't answer that. He just gathered Maya's things and his own jacket off the hook by the kitchen, and Carl Hutchins, still standing frozen by the register, said nothing at all as they walked past him and out the door, the bell ringing once, thin and small, behind them. Outside, on the cracked sidewalk in front of Rosie's diner, Vivian Cross rolled up beside them before they reached the corner. "Your chair," Elijah said, looking down. He'd noticed that the second Grant shoved it. The rear wheel wasn't tracking straight anymore, pulling slightly left with every push, the kind of thing a person without a particular set of half-forgotten skills might not have caught right away. But he'd spent enough of his life around bent axles and misaligned wheels, first on his childhood bicycle, and later on every used car he'd ever kept running past its natural lifespan, to recognize a wheel that had taken a hit it shouldn't have. Vivian looked down. She hadn't felt it yet. Not really. Still running on the adrenaline of the last 10 minutes. But now that he'd said it, she could feel the subtle drag on the left side, the small extra effort each push required. "It's probably fine," she said. "It's not," Elijah said. "It's going to get worse before it gets better. And if you're planning on going anywhere today, you don't want to find that out on a hill." She studied him for a second. "You know wheelchairs?" "I know axles," he said. "Same principle as a lot of things. You mind if I take a look?" There was a beat where she could have said no, where the old instinct, the one built over 2 years of strangers assuming her body was public property, the second it sat in chair, could have kicked in and told her to protect the small dignity of managing this herself. But something about the way he'd asked, "Mind if I take a look?" a question, not a command, not an assumption, made the instinct quiet down. "Okay," she said. Elijah glanced at Maya. "You okay to wait 5 minutes, baby? Read your book." Maya, who had already pulled her workbook back out and was sitting on the diner's front step with the easy adaptability of a kid who'd learned early that plans change fast and there wasn't much use fighting it, nodded without looking up. "I'm okay, Daddy." He walked the 4 blocks to Willow Street with Vivian rolling beside him, her damaged wheel dragging slightly the whole way, and up to the small garage bay behind the laundromat that the building's landlord let him use in exchange for keeping the old delivery van running, an arrangement that had, until about 20 minutes ago, been a nice supplement to his income and was now, suddenly, going to matter a great deal more. He worked on the wheel for 40 minutes. He didn't talk much while he worked, and Vivian didn't push him to. She sat in the doorway of the garage bay and watched a man who had just lost his job methodically, carefully, without a trace of resentment in his hands, straighten the bent axle housing on a stranger's wheelchair, check the bearing alignment, true the wheel until it rolled smooth and silent across the concrete floor. "You didn't have to do this," she said, when he finally stood up and wiped his hands on a rag. "I know," he said. "Why did you?" He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about most things Maya asked him, weighing the real answer against the easy one, and choosing the real one anyway. Because it needed doing, and I was the one standing here who knew how. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his face. Not performance, not the careful, managed kindness she'd gotten used to from people who wanted something from her. Back before this trip, back in the life she'd left running north on I-85 6 weeks ago. Just a plain, unadorned decency that didn't seem to be waiting for anything in return. "I owe you a job reference at minimum," she said. "You lost yours because of me. You didn't make him spill that coffee." Elijah said, "You didn't make Carl choose him over me. Those were their decisions. I'm not going to let you carry weight that isn't yours." She rolled the chair forward a few inches, testing the wheel, feeling the smooth, true roll of it for the first time in an hour. Something in her shoulders eased that she hadn't fully realized was tense. "Let me at least give you my number," she said, "in case anything comes up. In case you ever want to talk to someone who spent a career watching people like that boy get away with things they shouldn't get away with." Elijah hesitated. Something about her felt different from most of the customers who passed through Rosie's. Not wealthy exactly, though her clothes were quietly better made than they looked at first glance, and not desperate either, despite whatever put her alone in a small-town diner 400 miles from wherever she'd come from. Careful, that was the word for it. A woman who chose her words the way he chose which fights to pick. "All right," he said, and wrote his number on the back of a receipt from his pocket, and thought nothing more of it, because a man with $11 in his account and a daughter to feed by Friday does not have room in his head to wonder what a stranger from out of town might do with a phone number. He walked Maya home. He made dinner out of what was in the pantry. Pasta, a can of green beans, the last of the Parmesan scraped from the bottom of the container. Maya chattered through most of it about her school project, a diorama of the water cycle she was building out a shoebox, and Elijah listened and nodded and laughed in the right places. And underneath all of it, in the part of his mind that never fully stopped running numbers, he was already calculating how many days the pantry would last and how soon he'd need to start knocking on doors. He did not know that 400 miles away, in a hotel suite Vivian Cross had checked into that evening, instead of driving straight through to Atlanta, she was sitting at the small desk by the window with her laptop open, doing something she had not planned on doing when she woke up that morning. She was looking him up. It didn't take long. Millbrook was small enough, and public records were public enough, that within an hour she had assembled a rough outline of Elijah Turner's life. She found the Georgia Southern enrollment record, the withdrawal after his wife's death, transcript excerpts good enough to make her sit back in her chair and read them twice. She found a 5-year-old local news clip, barely 2 minutes long, about a stormwater project built off a college student's senior design. His name buried in the 4th paragraph, uncredited in the county's own press release. She found 2 years of employment history at Rosie's Diner, and nothing before that, but the university records and a 6-month gap that told its own story better than any document could. She thought about the way he'd crouched down to talk to his daughter at her eye level in the middle of the worst moment of his week. She thought about the way he'd fix a stranger's wheelchair with the unhurried, exact care of a man who didn't know how to do a job halfway. She thought about her own boardroom, 11 people who had built careers on her name and abandoned her the second the math got uncomfortable, and she thought about a line cook who had just done the opposite of that, for a woman he owed absolutely nothing. Vivian Cross had spent 19 years building a company on a single unglamorous belief that most organizations fail not because they lack talented people, but because they fail to notice the talented people who are already standing right in front of them, wearing the wrong uniform, in the wrong room, waiting for someone to finally look. She closed the laptop a little after midnight, and for the first time in 6 weeks, she thought about something other than the boardroom in Atlanta. She thought about what it might look like to build something new instead. The next morning, Elijah woke before his alarm, the old habit refusing to break even without a shift to get to. He lay in the dark for a few minutes doing the math he'd been doing all night in fragments between sleep, savings, $740 if he counted the emergency fund he'd been building for 2 years and hadn't quite finished building, rent due in 11 days, Maya's shoes getting tight at the toe, the electric bill. He got up. He made oatmeal. He braided Maya's hair, a little better than usual because his hands weren't shaking with exhaustion the way they usually were after a closing shift. He walked her to school and let her count birds at the mill wall, 5 sparrows and a mockingbird. And she declared a good morning, and he agreed with her, because there was no version of honesty that involved telling a 7-year-old the truth about how uncertain the next few weeks actually were. He spent the rest of that day walking Millbrook's small downtown, filling out applications by hand at the hardware store, the gas station, the other diner on the other side of the square, that everyone called the new one, even though it had been open for 11 years. Nobody was hiring. Millbrook was the kind of town where jobs didn't open up so much as get passed, quietly, between people who already knew each other, and Elijah, for all his 2 years behind Rosie's counter, had never quite crossed into that inner circle of belonging. By Friday, his phone still hadn't rung with anything promising, and the number he'd written on the back of a receipt 3 days earlier had gone entirely out of his mind, buried under more immediate arithmetic of survival. It rang on Saturday morning, while he was scrubbing the kitchen sink and half listening to Maya narrate an elaborate story involving her stuffed rabbit and what she called a spy mission that seemed to mostly involve hiding behind the couch. He almost didn't answer the unfamiliar number. He was glad, later, that he did. Elijah Turner, Vivian's voice said when he picked up, "It's Vivian from the diner. Ms. Vivian." He wiped his hands on a dish towel, surprised by how genuinely glad he was to hear from her, though he couldn't have said exactly why. "How's the will holding up?" "Perfectly," she said. "Smoothest it's rolled in months, actually. I wanted to ask you something, and I need you to hear the whole question before you answer it, because I think your instinct is going to be to say no before I finish." Elijah leaned against the counter, something in her tone making him pay closer attention than the small talk had warranted. "All right, I'm listening." "I'd like to come back to Millbrook next week," Vivian said. "I'd like to buy you coffee, somewhere other than Rosie's, obviously. And I'd like to talk to you about your engineering background and about a project I'm working on that I think you might be uniquely suited for. I'm not offering you charity. Elijah, I don't do charity. I'm offering you a conversation. Because I think I've been looking for exactly the kind of person you turn out to be, and I didn't expect to find him behind a diner counter in a town I only stopped in because I needed gas." Elijah was quiet for a moment. Maya's spy mission narration had gone quiet too, in the way children's attention sometimes does when they sense a conversation matters even if they can't follow the words. "I appreciate that," Elijah said carefully, "but I don't know you. I don't know what kind of project this is, or what kind of company you run, or—" "Fair," Vivian said. "Then let me tell you." A pause. The kind of pause that told him she'd rehearsed this next part, or at least thought carefully about how to say it. "My name is Vivian Cross. I'm the founder and CEO of Cross Dynamics. You may not have heard of it. Most people outside the industry haven't, on purpose. That's how I've always preferred it. But we build logistics and infrastructure systems, distribution hubs, transportation corridors, accessible public infrastructure. Right now, we're less than 4 months from breaking ground on the largest project in our company's history, a fully integrated logistics and community hub outside Atlanta. And I have spent the last 6 weeks watching my own leadership team argue about accessibility standards like they're a line item instead of moral floor. I need someone on that project who understands drainage and load design and structural engineering, and who also understands, in his own body and his own life, what it actually costs when a system is built without thinking about the people it's supposed to serve. I don't need someone with a finished degree, Elijah, I need someone with your judgment. The degree, if you want it, is something we can finish together. Elijah stood very still in his kitchen, the dish towel forgotten in his hand. Maya watching him now with wide, curious eyes from her spot on the living room floor. That's a lot to take in from a phone call, he said finally. I know, Vivian said. That's why I'm asking for coffee, not a signature. Take the week. Think about it. I'll be in Millbrook next Thursday at 10, at the little bakery on the square, the one with the blue awning. If you come, we'll talk. If you don't, I'll understand, and I'll still make sure Carl Hutchins hears exactly what I think of how he runs that diner, because that part isn't conditional on anything you decide. She hung up before he could answer, which he later understood was deliberate. She was not. He would learn over the coming months. A woman who liked to watch people feel pressured into decisions in real time. Elijah stood in his kitchen for a long moment after the call ended, staring at nothing in particular. Daddy, Maya said, "Who was that?" He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, sitting cross-legged on their second-hand rug with a stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. Growing up in an apartment above a laundromat because life had handed her father a series of losses, he'd absorbed one at a time without ever quite getting put any of them down. That, he said slowly, might have been somebody important, baby. I'm not sure yet. He did not sleep much that week. He read everything he could find about cross dynamics on the library's public computer, because his own laptop had died 8 months earlier and joining the list of things he hadn't been able to afford to replace. He found what Vivian had told him was mostly true. A company that had, unusually for its size, built a reputation over 2 decades for hiring people the rest of the industry overlooked, for retrofitting old warehouses instead of demolishing them, for a founder who rarely gave interviews and appeared in almost no photographs. He found one photograph from an industry trade publication 8 years old, of Vivian Cross standing at a ribbon cutting, before the accident, before the wheelchair, her hand raised mid-gesture, her face caught in an expression of particular fierce satisfaction of someone who had built something real with her own 2 hands and intended to keep building. He thought about Thursday for 6 straight days. He thought about the box of engineering textbooks under his bed, about the 3 semesters he'd never finished, about the stormwater project some county engineer had built without ever knowing his name. He thought about Maya and rent, and the particular fear of trusting a stranger with the only stability he had left to lose. He also thought, more than once, about the way Vivian Cross had sat in her wheelchair with coffee soaking into her lap and absorbed the humiliation without breaking, and the way she'd looked at him afterward like she was seeing something she hadn't expected to find. He thought about the fact that she had called when she didn't have to and offered him a conversation instead of a favor. Thursday morning, he braided Maya's hair, walked her to school, counted birds of the mill wall, 3 crows, and improbably a single red cardinal that made Maya gasp and grab his sleeve. And then he put on the one collared shirt he owned that didn't have a diner logo stitched onto the pocket, and he walked to the bakery on the square with the blue awning. Vivian Cross was already there, at a corner table with clearance for her chair. 2 coffees already ordered, 1 black, 1 with cream, because she'd remembered, apparently, exactly how he liked it from a single order 2 weeks earlier. "You came," she said, and there was something almost relieved in her voice, though she covered it quickly. "I came to listen," Elijah said, sitting down across from her. "I haven't decided anything." "That's exactly the right amount of trust to bring to a stranger," Vivian said. "I'd be worried about you if you brought more." They talked for 2 hours. She told him about the Atlanta project in real detail this time. The site plan, the accessibility standards her own board had tried to water down to save 11% on the budget, the community center at its center that she designed, in her own head, around every frustration she'd lived through in the 2 years since her accident, every doorway too narrow, every ramp built at a grade that technically met code and practically punished anyone who had to use it. She told him she needed someone in the engineering leadership who would fight for those details in a room full of people who saw them as line items, and that she spent 6 weeks watching her existing team fail that test, and that watching him refuse to fold in front of Grant Ashford over a stranger with his own job and his daughter's stability on the line, had told her more about his judgment than any resume ever could. "I'm not finishing your interview process for a job you already have," Elijah said. "You don't know if I can actually do the work. You know I can be stubborn in a diner. I know your senior design project got built by Wilkes County 2 years after you left school," Vivian said. "Uncredited. I looked it up. I know the drainage gradient you specified was better than what the county engineer of record submitted for the follow-up phase, because I had someone who understands stormwater systems review both documents this week." She let that sit for a second. "I don't guess about talent, Elijah. I verify it. That's why I'm sitting here." Elijah was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "What happens to Maya if this doesn't work out?" he asked finally. It was, underneath everything, the only question that actually mattered to him. "What happens to us if I uproot her life for a job with a company I met a week ago?" Vivian nodded, like she'd expected exactly that question, like she respected him more for asking it than she would have if he'd said yes immediately. "I'll be honest with you," she said. "I can't promise you it'll be easy. New places are hard on kids sometimes, and Atlanta's a different pace than Millbrook. But I can promise you this. The position comes with real salary, real benefits, relocation assistance, and tuition support to finish your degree on whatever timeline works for your life, not some accelerated program that runs you into the ground. And I can promise you that if it doesn't work, if in 6 months you decide this isn't the right fit, I will help you land somewhere it is. Because I don't build relationships on obligation, Elijah. I build them on judgment. And my judgment says you're worth investing in whether or not you ever say yes to this specific job." Elijah looked at her for a long time. Outside the bakery window, Millbrook's small square went about its Thursday morning. Cars circling the block, an old man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the hardware store. The same rhythm that held this town together his entire life. The only rhythm he'd known since Renata died and the world narrowed down to the size of what he could carry alone. "Can I think about it through the weekend?" he said. "I need to talk to Maya. She's not a detail in this. She's the whole reason any of it matters." "That," Vivian said, "is exactly the answer I was hoping you'd give." He talked to Maya that Saturday, sitting on the edge of her bed while she braided her stuffed rabbit's ears with the same careful concentration she brought to everything. "How would you feel about moving somewhere new?" he asked her. "A city, bigger school, new friends to make." Maya considered this with her usual seriousness. "Would you still braid my hair?" "Every morning." "Would we still count birds?" "We'd find new birds to count." She thought about it a little longer. "Is it because of the lady in the wheelchair? The one whose coffee spilled?" "It is." "Is she nice?" Elijah thought about the way Vivian Cross had absorbed a public humiliation without breaking, the way she trusted a stranger to fix her wheelchair, the way she called back a week later not with favor, but with a real offer built on real respect. "Yeah, baby, I think she is." Maya nodded, filing away the way she filed everything away. "Okay," she said, "but I want to bring Captain." She held up the stuffed rabbit. "And I want to pick my own room color." "Deal," Elijah said, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 6 years. He called Vivian on Sunday evening. "Yes," he said, before she'd even finished saying hello. "We'll come." The move happened over the following 6 weeks, faster than Elijah would have believed possible, though he later learned that fast for Vivian Cross usually meant she had already handled the logistics 3 steps ahead of the conversation. Relocation assistance turned out to mean an actual moving company and a 2-month furnished apartment near the project site, while they found something permanent. The tuition support turned out to mean a night program at Georgia State that let him finish his last 3 semesters around a full-time work schedule, with cross dynamics covering the differences old scholarship no longer applied to. The job itself was harder than he expected, and more satisfying than he'd let himself imagine in 6 years of not letting himself imagine much of anything beyond the next grocery bill. He sat in rooms with architects and city planners twice his age and said things they didn't want to hear about ramp gradients and doorway widths and the difference between what technically met code and what actually served a human being trying to move through a space with a wheelchair or a walker or a cane, and more often than not, because Vivian Cross was in a room backing him with the full weight of her authority. The rooms listened. Carl Hutchins, for his part, received a letter from Cross Dynamics' legal department roughly 3 weeks after Elijah left Millbrook, informing him that the building lease held by Whitfield Ashford's holding company, the same lease Carl had spent 2 years being terrified of losing, had quietly been purchased by a subsidiary of Cross Dynamics as part of an unrelated regional acquisition, and that going forward, employment decisions at any tenant business would be expected to meet a documented standard of non-discrimination reviewed annually as a condition of continued occupancy. Carl kept his job. He also, according to the one former co-worker who still texted Elijah occasionally, stopped letting Grant Ashford's table get away with anything at all. Grant Ashford himself did not fare quite as well. The Courier-Journal piece never happened to him. This wasn't that story, but word travels in small towns the way water finds every crack in old concrete, and by the time the spring semester started, most of Millbrook had heard some version of what happened in Rosie's Diner that Thursday, retold and reshaped a dozen different ways, but always landing on the same basic shape. The Ashford boy had humiliated a woman in a wheelchair, and a black line cook had made him leave and lost his job for it. And it had turned out, small towns love this part most of all, that the woman in the wheelchair had been quietly worth more than the entire Ashford family fortune combined. Whitfield Ashford, who valued his family standing in Millbrook more than almost anything else in his life, was not pleased. Grant spent that summer, by most accounts, doing an internship in his father's company's leased visible department, a long way from lake houses and diner booths, learning, or at least being made to sit through the lesson, whether he absorbed it or not, that consequences existed even for people who had never met one before. None of that was really Elijah's concern. In the end, he'd said his piece in the diner. He hadn't asked for anything more than that, and he found, once the dust settled, that he didn't need anything more than that either. Vindication had never been the goal. Doing right by a stranger, in the one moment he had the power to, had been the whole of it. 6 months after the day the coffee hit the floor, Elijah Turner stood at the edge of a construction site outside Atlanta, hard hat on, tablet in hand, walking the framing crew through a ramp specification he'd redesigned himself after catching an error in the original architectural plans. A 2-degree grade difference that would have made the community center's main entrance technically compliant and practically miserable for exactly the kind of person it was supposed to serve. Vivian Cross rolled up beside him, watching the crew work. "You caught something my own architecture firm missed," she said. "Twice now. I've had some practice noticing things other people design around instead of for," Elijah said. "I want to make you Director of Accessibility Engineering." Vivian said, "Full title, full authority. Seat at the design table on every project going forward, not just this one. I should have offered it to you from the start. Honestly, I was still figuring out how much I could ask of a man I'd known for 6 weeks. Elijah looked out at the half-built frame of the community center rising against the Georgia sky, a building that would, within the year, house a job training center, a public library branch, an accessible playground his own daughter had drawn a design suggestion for on a napkin one night at dinner, half of which had actually made it into the final plans. "I'll take it," he said, "on one condition." "Name it." "The playground gets built exactly the way Maya drew it. She's very particular about the swing set." Vivian laughed, a real laugh, unguarded. The kind he hadn't heard from her in the early weeks, when she was still learning to trust that this new life she'd built for herself wasn't going to collapse the way the old one had. "Deal," she said. That evening, Elijah picked Maya up from her after-school program at the community center's temporary offices, where she'd taken doing her homework at a folding table near the site trailer, watching the building rise a little more each week. She was 7 going on 8 now, taller than she'd been in Millbrook, her hair grown out enough that the braids took longer, but she'd learned to sit still for them without complaint. Mostly. "Daddy," she said, climbing into the car, "Miss Vivian said the swing set is really getting built the way I drew it." "That's right," Elijah said. "Even the part where it goes really high?" "Within reason," he said, and she made a face at him. And he laughed and pulled out a lot toward the small house they'd finally settled into 3 months earlier, with a yard and a room Maya had picked a color for herself, robin's egg blue, and a wall in the hallway where Elijah had finally, after 6 years, hung his diploma next to a framed photograph of Renata holding a 2-year-old Maya on a porch swing none of them had ever gotten back to. "Daddy," Maya said, somewhere around the 3rd stoplight, in the particular tone she used when a question had been sitting in her for a while before she found the nerve to ask it. "Do you think that lady's coffee spilling was a bad thing or a good thing?" Elijah thought about it, the way he thought about most of her questions, weighing the real answer against the easy one. "I think it was a bad thing that happened," he said finally, "but I think what we did after it happened turned into something good. Those aren't always opposites. Baby, sometimes the worst moment of somebody's day ends up being the door that opens into something better, if enough people decide to walk through it the right way instead of the easy way." Maya nodded, filing it away, the way she filed everything away, and looked out the window at the city going by, the cranes and the half-built frames of buildings that would, in a year or two, be full of people moving through spaces someone had finally, carefully, thought to build for all of them. "I like our new life," she said after a while. "Me too, baby," Elijah said, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in 6 long years. "Me too." If this story reminded you that goodness is never wasted, even when it costs something in the moment, subscribe to Real Single Dad Stories and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We'll be back next week with another story of courage, quiet strength, and second chances.